The wind howled through the shattered remnants of the village, carrying the scent of ash and memory. A frail figure stood on the sagging porch of a weathered cottage, her trembling hands clutching a photograph so worn its edges curled like dying leaves. She was Alara, a grandmother whose eyes held the weight of decades, and she was staring at a young soldier who had stumbled into her forgotten corner of the world. Alara's gaze was not one of accusation, but of desperate searching, as if she could peel back time itself. The soldier, barely 20, stood rigid under her scrutiny, his uniform tattered from a war that had already claimed too much. His name was Caleb, and he hadn't meant to end up here, in a place where the ghosts of the past seemed louder than the cannons he'd fled. "Stand there," Alara said, her voice a fragile thread, pointing to a patch of earth by the gate where wildflowers fought to grow. "Right there, where my boy used to stand." Caleb hesitated, his boots sinking into the mud, unsure why this command felt heavier than any order he'd received in battle. The photograph in her hands trembled as she held it out, showing a young man with a grin as wide as the horizon, standing in that very spot. 40 years ago, this village had been alive with laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the dreams of youth. Alara's son, Thomas, had been the heart of it, a carpenter with hands that could coax beauty from rough timber. He'd promised her a new porch swing, one they'd sit on together when he returned from the war. But the war had other plans, and Thomas never came home. The swing remained unfinished, a skeleton of wood leaning against the barn. Caleb, still clutching his rifle, stepped toward the spot she'd indicated. His heart thudded, not from fear of snipers or mines, but from the way her eyes locked onto him, as if she saw someone else entirely. "What was his name?" Caleb asked, his voice softer than he intended. "Thomas," Alara whispered, her fingers tracing the photograph. "He was about your age when he left. Said he'd be back before the harvest." She paused, her breath catching. The harvest came and went. 40 times. Caleb swallowed, his throat dry. He didn't know why he'd stopped here, in this ghost of a village, after deserting his unit. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the way the cottage's light flickered like a beacon in the dusk. But now, standing where Thomas once stood, he felt the weight of a promise he hadn't made. Alara invited him inside, her movements slow but deliberate. The cottage was a museum of memory-faded curtains, a cracked teapot, and a table where Thomas's carvings still sat, half-finished. She offered Caleb a bowl of thin soup, the only food she had, and he accepted it with a guilt he couldn't name. As they sat, she spoke of Thomas, his love for the stars, his habit of whistling off-key, the way he'd promised to name his first child after her. "You look like him, you know," Alara said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Caleb froze, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "Not your face, but your eyes. Like you've seen too much, but still hope for something better." Caleb didn't know how to respond. He'd seen death, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of his own courage. Hope felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Yet, under Alara's gaze, he felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost. He stayed that night, sleeping on a cot by the hearth, the photograph of Thomas watching him from the mantel. The next morning, Alara asked him to stay longer. "Just a day," she said, her voice pleading. "Help me fix the swing." It's what Thomas would have done. Caleb, who had planned to move on, found himself nodding. He didn't know how to build, but he couldn't say no to the woman who looked at him like he was her son returned. As they worked, Alara told stories of the village before the war, children playing in the fields, dances under the stars, and Thomas's dream of building a school. Caleb listened, hammering nails into the swing, each strike a small act of defiance against the despair that had followed him. But as the sun dipped low, a shadow crossed the yard. A man, grizzled and limping, appeared at the gate, his eyes narrowing at Caleb. "Who's this?" the man growled, his hand resting on a knife at his belt. Alara's face paled, but she stood tall. "This is Caleb," she said. "He's helping me." The man, introduced as Jonah, was a scavenger who'd taken to guarding the village's ruins. His presence was a jolt, a reminder that the world outside Alara's cottage was not kind. Jonah's suspicion cut through the warmth of the day. "You a deserter?" he asked Caleb, his voice low and dangerous. Caleb's silence was answer enough. Jonah sneered but didn't press further, instead turning to Alara. "You trust too easy, old woman. He'll rob you blind and leave you to rot." Alara's eyes flashed. He's standing where Thomas stood. That's enough for me. Jonah scoffed but stayed, watching Caleb like a hawk. The tension grew as they finished the swing, each creak of the wood amplifying the unspoken questions. Who was Caleb, really? And why did Alara trust him? That night, as Caleb lay on the cot, Jonah's words echoed in his mind. He wasn't Thomas, and he wasn't a hero. He was a runaway, carrying secrets he couldn't share. But Alara's faith in him, however misplaced, stirred something deep within. As he drifted to sleep, he heard her humming a tune Thomas used to whistle. The dawn broke gray and heavy, casting long shadows across the village's skeletal remains. Caleb woke to the sound of Alara's soft footsteps, her silhouette moving through the cottage like a ghost tending to her duties. He lay still, the weight of Jonah's accusations pressing against the fragile hope Alara had kindled in him. Over breakfast, Alara spoke of the village's past with a fervor that belied her frail frame. Thomas wanted to rebuild this place, she said, her eyes distant. He said a community could rise again, even after war. Caleb listened, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, wondering if such dreams were possible in a world that seemed to thrive on destruction. Jonah appeared at the door, his presence as abrupt as a storm. You're still here, he said, eyeing Caleb. Thought you'd be gone by now. Alara ignored him, handing Caleb a small chisel. Thomas's, she said. Use it to carve something for the swing. He'd want it to have life. Caleb took the tool, its handle worn smooth by hands long gone, and felt an unexpected connection to a man he'd never met. They worked through the morning, Caleb carving simple patterns into the swing's armrests while Alara watched, her smile fragile but real. Jonah lingered nearby, sharpening his knife with deliberate slowness. You think you're doing her a favor? He muttered to Caleb. You're just giving her false hope. She'll break when you leave. Caleb's grip tightened on the chisel. I'm not here to hurt her, he said, his voice low. Jonah laughed, a harsh sound. You're a soldier. Hurting's all you know. The words stung, but Caleb kept carving, each stroke a small rebellion against Jonah's cynicism. As noon approached, a new figure emerged from the misty young woman, her clothes patched but clean, carrying a basket of herbs. Her name was Lila, and she greeted Alara with a warmth that softened the old woman's face. Brought you some mint, Lila said, her eyes flicking to Caleb with curiosity. Who's this? Caleb, Alara said proudly. He's fixing Thomas's swing. Lila's gaze lingered, her expression unreadable. She was a wanderer, she explained, trading herbs for supplies in the scattered villages. But there was something more to Hera's quiet strength that made Caleb uneasy, as if she saw through him. Lila stayed, helping Alara sort the herbs while watching Caleb work. Her presence shifted the dynamic, easing the tension between Caleb and Jonah. She spoke of the world beyond the village camps where survivors banded together, rumors of peace talks, and whispers of a resistance against the warlords who still ravaged the land. Caleb listened, his heart racing. He hadn't told Alara or Jonah about his desertion, but Lila's words felt like a mirror held to his choices. That afternoon, as they sat on the finished swing, Alara shared a story that changed everything. Thomas didn't die in battle, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was taken, a prisoner, they said. I waited years for news, but none came. Caleb's breath caught. The photograph, the story set wasn't just grief holding Alara here. It was hope, however faint, that Thomas might still be alive. Jonah scoffed. He's gone, Alara. Stop torturing yourself. But Lila's eyes met Caleb's, and in them, he saw a flicker of something knowledge, perhaps, or suspicion. I've heard stories, Lila said carefully. Prisoners from that war, some still held in camps up north. Alara's hands trembled, clutching the photograph tighter. Caleb's mind raced. He'd heard of those camps, brutal places where men were worked to death, or worse. If Thomas was alive, the odds of finding him were slim. Yet Alara's hope was a fire that refused to die, and it burned into Caleb's resolve. I'll go, he said before he could stop himself. I'll find out if he's there. Jonah laughed bitterly. You? A deserter? You'll get yourself killed. But Alara's eyes shone with tears, and she reached for Caleb's hand. You'd do that for me, she whispered. Caleb nodded, though fear gnawed at him. He wasn't a hero, but for Alara, he wanted to try. Lila offered to guide him. I know the roads, she said, and I've got contacts who might help. Jonah shook his head but didn't argue, his silence heavy with doubt. As they prepared to leave, Alara pressed Thomas's chisel into Caleb's hands. "Bring it back," she said, her voice breaking. "And maybe bring him back too." The road ahead was uncertain, but as Caleb stepped away from the cottage, he felt the weight of Alara's hope anchoring him. Lila walked beside him, her basket slung over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and searching. Jonah watched them go, his knife glinting in the fading light. The road north was a scar across the earth, littered with the bones of forgotten battles. Caleb walked beside Lila, his rifle slung across his back, Thomas's chisel tucked into his pocket like a talisman. Every step felt like a betrayal of the soldier he'd been, yet Alara's face her fragile, hope pushed him forward. Lila moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the horizon for threats. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were sharp and deliberate. "You didn't have to do this," she said one evening, as they camped under a skeletal tree. "Alara's hope is her burden, not yours." Caleb stared into the fire, the flames reflecting the guilt he carried. "She looked at me like I was her son," he said. "I couldn't walk away." Lila's gaze softened, but only slightly. "You're running from something," she said. "Deserters always are." Caleb tensed, but she didn't press. Instead, she shared her own story of family lost to the war, a life spent wandering to survive. "Alara's one of the few who still believes in something," Lila added. "That's why I keep coming back to her." Their journey took them through ruined towns and past wary survivors, each encounter a reminder of the war's lasting wounds. One night, they stumbled upon a group of travelers, their faces gaunt but their eyes alight with purpose. Their leader, a wiry man named Amos, claimed to be part of a resistance network. "We've got word of camps up north," he said, studying Caleb's uniform with suspicion. "Prisoners from the old war, still alive. You looking for someone?" Caleb hesitated, then showed Amos the photograph of Thomas. The man's eyes widened. "I've seen him," Amos said, his voice low. "Or someone like him. In a camp near the border." Lila's hand gripped Caleb's arm, her nails digging in. "You sure?" she asked. Amos nodded. "He was alive last I heard. But those camps, they break men." The revelation hit Caleb like a blow. Thomas alive? It seemed impossible, yet Alara's hope now felt like a map he could follow. But Amos's next words chilled him. "If you're going in, you need to know those camps are guarded by men who've forgotten mercy. And they don't take kindly to deserters." Caleb's heart sank. His secret was a liability, one that could doom them all. Lila, sensing his fear, made a decision. "We'll go in at night," she said. "I know a way through the patrols." Amos offered to join them, his resistance fighters eager to strike at the camp's guards. Caleb, torn between fear and duty, agreed. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he could be something else, someone who kept a promise. The camp loomed under a moonless sky, its barbed wire glinting like teeth. Caleb's stomach churned as they crept closer, Lila's steady presence the only thing keeping him grounded. Amos and his fighters spread out, ready to create a diversion. But as they neared the perimeter, a figure stepped from the Shadowsa guard, younger than Caleb, his face pale and haunted. "Don't," the guard whispered, his rifle trembling. "You don't know what you're walking into." Caleb froze, recognizing the fear in the boy's eyes. It was his own, months ago, when he'd fled his unit. The twist was a knife in Caleb's chest. This guard, barely more than a boy, knew Thomas. He led them through the camp, past cages where men sat hollow-eyed, their spirits broken. Thomas was there, older, thinner, but unmistakably the man from Alara's photograph. His eyes, once bright, were dulled by years of captivity, but they lit up when he saw Caleb's uniform. "You're here to get us out," he rasped. Caleb nodded, though his heart pounded with doubt. Amos's diver's Iona fire at the camp's edge erupted, drawing the guards away. Lila and the young guard worked quickly, unlocking Thomas's cage. But as they moved to escape, shouts rang out. The camp was waking, and Caleb realized the cost of this rescue might be higher than he'd imagined. The camp erupted into chaos, flames licking the sky as Amos's diversion drew the guards' fury. Caleb supported Thomas, whose frail frame trembled with each step, while Lila and the young guard whose name was Eli led the way through the maze of barbed wire. Shouts and gunfire echoed behind them, a reminder that freedom was not yet theirs. Thomas's voice was weak but urgent. "My mother, Alara. Is she still waiting?" Caleb's throat tightened. She's waiting, he said. She never stopped. Thomas's eyes, clouded with pain, flickered with something like hope. Caleb felt the weight of that hope, heavier than the rifle he'd abandoned in the escape. Lila's knowledge of the terrain saved them, guiding the group through a ravine where the guards' searchlights couldn't reach. Eli, torn between his duty and his conscience, stayed close, his face a mask of conflict. "I'll be hunted for this," he muttered, but he didn't turn back. Caleb saw himself in Eli the same fear, the same need to be more than what the war had made him. They traveled for days, hiding in abandoned barns and scavenging for food. Thomas grew weaker, his body ravaged by years in the camp, but his spirit clung to the thought of Alara. Caleb, too, clung to her image, the frail grandmother who'd seen something in him he hadn't seen in himself. Lila watched over them all, her strength a quiet anchor, though Caleb sensed she carried her own unspoken burdens. One night, as they rested in a crumbling church, Thomas spoke of his capture. "They took me during a raid," he said, his voice hoarse. "I kept thinking of her, of the swing I promised. I carved her name into the camp's walls, so I'd never forget." Caleb pulled the chisel from his pocket, handing it to Thomas. "She gave me this," he said. Thomas's fingers closed around it, tears streaking his face. The journey back was fraught with danger. Patrols roamed the roads, and hunger gnawed at their strength. Eli's knowledge of the guards' patterns kept them one step ahead, but Caleb knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. Lila, ever vigilant, revealed her own secret one evening. She wasn't just a wanderer. She'd been part of the resistance, gathering intelligence on the camps. "I didn't tell you because I didn't trust you," she admitted to Caleb. "But you're different now." Caleb didn't feel different. He felt like a fraud, a deserter playing at heroism. But Thomas's gratitude and Lila's quiet approval chipped away at his doubt. As they neared the village, the sight of Alara's cottage, its light still burning, felt like a miracle. Caleb's heart raced with fear and anticipation. Would Alara recognize her son? Would Thomas survive the reunion? They reached the porch at dawn, the swing creaking softly in the breeze. Alara stood at the door, her hands trembling as she saw Thomas. "My boy," she whispered, stumbling forward. Thomas, supported by Caleb and Lila, reached for her, their embrace a fragile bridge across 40 years of loss. Eli stood back, his eyes wet, knowing he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. Alara's tears soaked Thomas's shoulder as she clung to him, her voice a mix of joy and disbelief. "You brought him back," she said to Caleb, her words a benediction. Caleb shook his head. "Lila and Eli did as much as me." But Alara's eyes held his, and in them, he saw forgiveness for the man he'd been. The village, though broken, felt alive again with Thomas's return. Lila promised to stay, to help rebuild what the war had taken. Eli, now a fugitive, chose to join the resistance, his path uncertain but his purpose clear. Caleb, too, faced a choice: stay and help, or keep running from his past. As he stood by the swing, watching Alara and Thomas laugh through their tears, Caleb realized he'd found something worth staying for. The war had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything. Alara's hope, Thomas's survival, and the unlikely family they'd formed were proof of that.